Hello and welcome to the first in a series of webinars sponsored and produced by Freedom Declared Foundation. My name is James Holt and I currently serve as a trustee of Freedom Declared Foundation, as well as being Associate Professor of Religious Education at the University of Chester. I'll be chairing and hosting today's webinar. Freedom Declared Foundation was set up to promote freedom of religion or belief within the United Kingdom in a way which is not biased to any one faith or belief. We believe that throughout government departments across the United Kingdom, the importance of religion and belief in individuals' lives may not be truly understood, and this may result in lower awareness about the implementation of freedom of religion or belief in the United Kingdom. This first episode aims to explore the place of freedom of religion and belief and the understanding of it within the context of the COVID pandemic. With governments around the UK closing places of worship and restricting religious activities, Freedom Declared Foundation wants to understand more deeply the interaction between governments and the different groups. We're very pleased to welcome three panelists today from different backgrounds to discuss these issues. Allow me to introduce them in turn. Jagtar Singh Gill is a UK-born master's graduate who successfully manages a family business. Jagtar is a proud British Sikh who advocates his Sikh faith for the betterment of society. He was the General Secretary of Leamington and Warwick Gurdwara in 2009 and part of the core team which delivered on a new £11 million project for a Sikh place of worship. Jagtar has played his part in advocating Sikh issues for a national Sikh body, Sikh Council UK, and was its General Secretary from 2017 through to 2019. A key success was enshrining in law the legal right for ensuring Sikhs could wear their turbans in all workplaces, which came into effect through primary legislation in 2015. Jagtar currently is a trustee and founding member of the Sikh Assembly, which champions the Sikh contribution to the fabric of UK society and is a key member of the government's roundtable for Sikh leaders, which amongst other matters advised government on the closing and reopening of Sikh places of worship during the pandemic. Our second guest is Bishop John Keenan. Bishop John was born on the 19th of December 1964 in Glasgow. He was educated at the Salesian College, Shrigley Park, Cheshire, the University of Glasgow, and the Gregorian University, Rome. Having studied at the Pontifical Scots College, Rome, he was ordained a priest on 9th of July 1995 in St Gregory's, Winford, by Cardinal Thomas Winning, Archbishop of Glasgow. He was an assistant priest in Christ the King, Kings Park from 1995 to 2000, and chaplain at Holyrood High School, Glasgow from 1997 to 2000. He was a lecturer in philosophy at Scotus College, Glasgow from 1995 to 2005. He was appointed as chaplain to the University of Glasgow from 2000 to 2014, and parish priest of St Patrick's, Anderson from 2013 to 14. He was appointed vocation directors of the Archdiocese of Glasgow 2013 to 14. He was nominated as Bishop of Paisley by Pope Francis on the 8th of February 2014 and was ordained the 5th Bishop of Paisley on 19th of March 2014 by Archbishop Philip Tartaglia, the Archbishop of Glasgow, and his predecessor in Paisley. Our final guest is Richy Thompson. Richy is Director of Public Affairs and Policy at Humanists UK, and Richy has worked on issues from across Humanists UK's public policy remit. In recent years, he's primarily focused on marriage laws and international freedom of religion and belief. He has also contributed to Humanists UK's response to the pandemic. Thank you all three of you for being with us today. I'd like to begin with a tweet from Robert Jenrick. He said, "On behalf of Boris Johnson, I will be convening leaders of all the faiths to plan the reopening of places of worship, whether for public worship or individual prayer. We will work together to agree how and when to do so, whilst protecting the public and controlling the virus." This was last June. So my question for you is, he said he would be convening leaders of all faiths. So did all faiths and beliefs have representatives on the government's task force, to your knowledge? And were the right people invited to be on these task forces? Any thoughts?
Well, I suppose I might go first and say no, we weren't involved. Just to provide a little bit of context, Humanists UK has worked on coronavirus response across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We don't deal with Scotland because our sister charity, Humanist Society Scotland, deals with all devolved matters in Scotland. So I can't speak to how things went in Scotland. But when it comes to England, the UK government's task force on community-related matters, shall we say, within the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government was a Places of Worship task force. While I wouldn't dispute that issues around places of worship and opening of places of worship have been extremely important during the pandemic, that choice of framing effectively excluded us from many important conversations around religion or belief in the pandemic. That meant that when there were areas where we would need to have or want to have a say, we weren't able to. And I think it contrasts as well with what happened in Wales and Northern Ireland, where in Wales, the Welsh government had, I don't know if they had a places of worship task force actually, but either way, they certainly had a ceremonies task force, which we were a part of. And in Northern Ireland, they've had a more general faith and belief communities round table, which again we've been fully part of. So that has enabled us to be more actively involved in such conversations in Wales and Northern Ireland than we have been in England, and that's been unfortunate, and it's also had some unfortunate consequences which I might come on to in due course.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Richard. That's really interesting because yes, they automatically, I suppose, just by framing it as places of worship, excluded the voices of humanists and those who are non-religious, who, according to every kind of thing that's done, form a very large part of the UK community as a whole. Bishop John, did you have anything to say around that?
Scotland had its own responses, as you know. That response was really spearheaded by what was called the Resilience Division of the Scottish Government, and then they worked with the COVID Health Response Directorate, which was from the Health and Social Care Directorate. That was led by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, by the Cabinet Secretary for Health, Humza Yousaf, and then various ministers of public health, and they had advisors, medical advisors, scientific advisors, nursing advisors, and economic advisors, and a national clinical advisor. That was the core team, and there were no task forces, as far as I am aware, for religion and belief. No task force. There were weekly meetings at various levels between a lead civil servant, head civil servant, who had a role in faith and belief, and there was a forum for the main Christian communities, the Church of Scotland, the Catholic Church, and the Episcopalian Church. And at the same time, there were weekly wider meetings of interfaith leaders, but those were leaders with meeting with civil servants and various other people. There weren't meetings with any government officials, so they're quite arm's length, really, more keeping in touch than anything else.
That's interesting because I did come across the Deputy First Minister, and it's reported that he's Catholic, and he suggested that he could attend Mass from his own home, which from my understanding of the Catholic faith, he can attend church and he can attend services, but the central feature, which is the Eucharist, is kind of missed in all of that. So does this suggest perhaps there are some people, and I don't need political comments, but who in government have a lack of understanding about the needs of religious communities and religions as a whole, even if they're a part of them themselves?
Well, John Swinney, who is the Deputy First Minister, he himself isn't Catholic, James, okay, but he's married to in a Catholic family, okay, and quite closely connected with the Catholic community. So I think John would I know that his family are practicing Catholics, and I imagine that he would go along to church. He's certainly quite comfortable among Catholic priests and bishops. But I do think, I mean, we may well come on to this, but there was just a question, really, from in our minds as members of faith communities specifically, and certainly the Scottish bishops, that there wasn't maybe the faith literacy in those who were organising the response to the pandemic that there might have been. And this was something that some of the Christian leaders, 26 Christian ministers and a Catholic priest, took a judicial review against the Scottish government's measures. And some of the points that the Lord Braid, the judge, made in passing were round about the religious and faith literacy of the government, and he certainly questioned how literate they were in some of the specifics and nuances of faith and worship.
That's interesting, because I think that was also reflected in England. And Jagtar, let me share with you a tweet, if I can, from Preet Kaur Gill, who's an MP. When Robert Jenrick kind of formed these groups, she said, Robert Jenrick has failed to include Sikh Gurdwaras, an SCUK official, the official body representing them, as part of the task force on reopening places of worship. Gurdwaras across the UK and organisations met today expressing no confidence in the task force. So it seems that someone from a professional organisation was appointed rather than someone from within the faith. So is that your experience, that perhaps Sikhs were represented, but sometimes by the wrong people?
I think the appointment at the time caused disquiet within the community. The individual selected, his sort of professional background, and and would, even as a Sikh, is fine. But I think just the manner this selection took place, and whereas other faith leaders were of a sort of a spiritual nuance that was missing from the appointment. And so there was disquiet within the community, and in the end, the individual stepped down and another person was appointed. But I think, if I recall at the time, things were moving at a pace, whereas with sort of established sort of faiths engaging with government, there would have been the spiritual leaders within the UK government could have approached. Not sure why government, when they did approach, didn't do a bit more homework to ensure that the right person, especially who had experience of Gurdwaras, and also was spiritually up to the mark, to where Sikhs would have confidence, and that there was an issue about confidence in the selection. But I think once we moved on from that, we as the community contributed to the task force and to the roundtable meetings, and managed to come up with good guidance, because the government didn't want sort of individual guidance, or the individual faiths wanted a single guidance. So they had to ensure that the beliefs and the teachings of the individual faith that they understood. So I think the heavy lifting was done probably around the Sikh leaders roundtable meetings rather than the task force itself. But it was an attempt by government to ensure there was representation from faith across the board. But in the Sikh experience, there was a faltering start.
Okay, and that may be linked with what Bishop John was saying, really, is that sometimes the faith literacy was kind of missing. And I know the government responded to this because they established a call for evidence in a faith engagement review. So they recognised that they had made some funding steps. And one of the issues I found, and I suppose I should declare my interest here, I'm from a minority faith community. I'm from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's my background. And Robert Jenrick talked about including people from all of the major faiths. And that, by definition, excluded some of the smaller religions, as well as humanists, from those discussions. And so decisions were being made that kind of didn't seem to take account of all of those. But I guess there's so many, how do we include all of those voices is one of the questions that they struggled with. So do you think the different faiths or the different beliefs, including humanists, Richy, were able to have any influence whatsoever over government policy with regards to their response to COVID or anything like that?
Yeah, I should build on what I say more generally to say that we were able to have influence in all sorts of ways. I mean, I referred earlier to in Wales and Northern Ireland how they took a different approach, but in the UK, well, in both England and Wales, they also had in the Department of Health and Social Care what they called a moral and ethical advisory group that advised on the response to the pandemic more generally from a moral and ethical point of view, and decisions that were being made, particularly around, you know, more directly on issues of health and social care, and you know, the vaccine rollout, things like that. And we sat on both of those bodies in England and Wales, so there we were able to have an influence, which is great. And we also were able to have an influence in other ways through talking to officials in particular on a more direct basis, who you know, were still, of course, keen to hear what we had to say and resolve problems. Unfortunately, it often was a case of resolving problems after or as they arose, rather than being able to prevent them from happening in the first place. Because I think one thing that was the case frequently is that, you know, these coronavirus regulations were, which of course I think everybody knows they were changing all the time, and to some extent still are, were often being announced almost at the time that they're about to be laid before Parliament, or, you know, they wouldn't be published until in any draft form, and the first you'd see of them was after they'd come into force already, and that often meant that problems were only being identified as or after they arose, and then there was sometimes a scramble to fix them, either through, you know, some clever interpretation of the regulations, or through guidance, or through trying to get them changed after the fact for when the next round of regulations were laid.
Thank you. Bishop John, you were nodding at some point during that, so I just wondered which bits.
Yeah, I think the point about really just that everything was had to be done. We're trying to keep up with a virus that is presenting there is a pandemic, is presenting a present and immediate danger, and was playing cat and mouse with us. So I think we were all aware. I mean, who would have had the government's job? Who would have taken the job of the Prime Minister or the First Minister or their team? You know, none of us would have taken their job, and everyone had different and changing opinions. So I think we do have to remember we are in the word that's used, unprecedented times. There's no rule book for this, but maybe that makes us realise that we have to have these protocols laid down before a crisis, principles laid down before the crisis, so that they can be lifted out and dusted down to deal with a crisis. I think probably this crisis has brought up to all of us that there isn't maybe as adequate an understanding between the government as a secular and political power and faith and belief communities as in the point from the perspective of faith communities, supernatural organizations, we believe, and then for Richy and the humanists, profoundly personal and shared beliefs that in a sense go above and beyond politics. And I think you know, post-pandemic, we would look to engage with the government to, you know, sit down and try to figure out, well, how do our respective independences and autonomies work, and then how do we within those carve out paths of cooperation. So one of the things that the Scottish bishops are considering is approaching the Scottish government with a view to seeing, could a protocol be established for church-state relations in normality, in normal circumstances, that would apply particularly in extremis, in circumstances such as we are just now.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say, because I think government ministers were responding very quickly and kind of on the hoof, and quite understandably everything was changing, but at the same time they were responding from their own backgrounds, if you like. And so if faith or belief wasn't a consideration in their thought process, then maybe they would struggle to make those connections. And I just wonder, Jagtar, because an essential part, as far as I'm aware, of Sikh worship is kirtan, which is the singing of the Guru.
Yes. Yeah.
And has that been curtailed, and how has that affected your community, and was that even considered by government when they began that process?
No, that's an excellent question, James, because just taking a step back, obviously when lockdown was first announced in sort of March, and places of worship had to close, there was a pushback from faith communities and the Sikh community that you can't just close places of worship. It took a short while for the understanding that actually we are in unprecedented times, and it's not about closing places of worship. It's about if the belief in those places of worship, including the Sikh places of worship, those would continue inside. It was closed to the public going in and out. So there was that sort of differential about what closing meant. And when the discussions then started about how do we safely reopen places of worship, I recall, meetings with the Lord Greenhalgh, the Minister for Faith, in the roundtable meeting, and when they were discussing numbers, and we were saying actually, for a Sikh wedding to take place, you can't do it with sort of a handful. You would need kirtan to be performed on the stage with somebody playing the tabla. You would need a priest that does the ceremony. So you would need sort of a minimum number, and it wasn't what the numbers they were talking about. So we managed to influence that policy. Also, as you mentioned, the singing of our religious Sikh scriptures. That's very much part of our belief system, and that was also taken into account because we couldn't have an Anand Karja Sikh ceremony, a Sikh place of worship. The singing is instrumental. So when that guidance was prepared, we definitely had a positive input into that. And then when government came out with its guidance, that was part of the guidance, and didn't mention the Sikh faith in name, but allowed singing, and allowed a co-companion that would be sitting on the stage as well. So I think it was a steep learning curve for government. Obviously, the United Kingdom, including Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, is predominantly a Christian country. So knowing the nuances between the faiths and how to reopen places of worship at a time when we were all going through such a trauma, I wouldn't say it was easy for government either, but I know the officials within MHCLG made a big effort to ensure that there was an understanding of the nuances in the faith, and they weren't sort of hurting or trespassing when they were issuing guidance, or when they were drafting guidance. So there was backwards and forwards with guidance to ensure that the practices within the faith were taken care of. Obviously, the numbers were the issue, but we all understand why those restrictions on numbers were in place because of the pandemic. But yeah, we had a sort of a positive role in that, and we were happy with the officials and the Minister for Faith, Lord Greenhalgh, his team, that did acknowledge the nuances of the Sikh faith.
That's great to hear, because sometimes I think I focus anyway on kind of some of the negatives. So during the pandemic, it's still during the pandemic, isn't it? But during the first lockdown, I had a daughter that was waiting to get married. And it seemed to be that there were all kinds of economic considerations, and there are all kinds of things that the government were paying attention to. But in terms of weddings, which was a religious rite for us, and she couldn't begin her new life, it just seemed to be an afterthought. But just staying with with kind of the idea of weddings, when some guidance was, I suppose, released in September last year, Richy, or maybe even the year, no, it was last year, the coronavirus law limited humanist weddings to 6 when others could have 15. Is that right? I don't quite understand the theory behind that. So I'm sure you don't either, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid I do.
Okay.
So humanist marriages are legally recognised in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but they're not in England and Wales. And this has been an ongoing issue for us for a very long time. The government has been consulting on the matter for 8 years now. They're onto their third review at the moment, and they still haven't committed to doing it. That's the kind of wider context. And if they do it, it looks like it'll be potentially maybe a couple of years at best away on their current timetable. And the result is that we have over 1,000 couples a year. In normal times, I think about 1,300 couples a year having humanist weddings in England and Wales, but without legal recognition. And they're doing that as a manifestation of their beliefs, but they all also have to have a separate civil marriage in order to get legal recognition. And that's because the law recognizes civil marriages and recognizes religious marriages in places of worship, so long as the place of worship is registered. Every religious group can register its places of worship. But obviously we don't have places of worship, and belief marriages are not recognized by law. Last year, incidentally, in July, 6 couples went to the High Court about that, and the judge at the High Court ruled that it was discrimination and that the government needed to change the law, but it still hasn't done it. Its intention is to wait for the current review, which, as I said, could take several more years. So that's an ongoing source of frustration, and the couples are appealing that to try and speed it up. But that's the background. And so then when we get to the coronavirus regulations, what happened was that, of course, initially all major life events were disallowed for a period of time during lockdown. And then after a while, it was eased up, whereby major life events could have 30. But then when the restrictions started coming back in September, they decided to narrow down the provisions to just legally recognised marriages, and said that legally recognised marriages could have 15, whereas for everybody else, the rule was the rule of 6. And as a result, because humanist marriages cannot be legally recognised at the moment, they fell under the rule of 6 uniquely, which is obviously a massive problem. And, again, a clear case of discrimination on the basis of freedom, religion or belief. And, so we became aware of this before the problem happened. When the government first made its announcement, it looked like under the announcement, which I think it must have done about a week before the changes happened, that this was going to be an issue. We basically started, as we got more and more alarmed about it. We didn't say anything public and just tried to work it out with officials in the run up to the regulations being laid. But when the regulations were laid, it became clear that this was a problem, at which point we, started seeking media for it. We got dozens of politicians raising the matter with government. And we also actually got 2 couples writing a letter before challenge to start a judicial review of the government over it. The consequence was that pretty quickly the government decided to fudge the matter and say that actually we could have up to 15 because our weddings could be classified as wedding receptions on the provisions that allowed up to 15 at wedding receptions. Now, our weddings are not wedding receptions, so this is obviously a pretty ridiculous state of affairs in a different way, and it also didn't entirely work either, because there was separate guidance that said that wedding receptions had to be sit down occasions, sit down meals, as is perhaps more standard for receptions, but again doesn't make sense in the context of humanist weddings. There were also questions about the link between the legally recognised marriage and the wedding reception. So the government said that the wedding reception had to be a certain period of time after the marriage, when of course humanist couples often won't choose to do that, or they might not even choose to have a legally recognised marriage at all, or they might have had their legally recognised marriage before the rules changed, not anticipating they'd have to have their humanist wedding within a certain period of time afterwards, etc., etc. The matter ultimately resolved itself in mid-October, because at that stage the government changed the regulations to allow for what they call alternative wedding ceremonies, to also have up to 15, which they defined as wedding ceremonies that were based on a faith or belief but weren't legally recognised. And that's been the position since, essentially, and has solved the problem since. We had similar problems in Wales, which the Welsh government, it was pretty much the same thing. The Welsh government partly argued for a period of time that they couldn't fix it because marriage law is not devolved to Wales, so the UK government would have to fix it. And eventually they relented by deciding that they could put the same thing in the coronavirus regulations that the UK government had done for England. We also have ongoing issues with our naming ceremonies, where they essentially are limited to whatever the lower number is for general public gatherings, because although for many religious groups they will have for example, christenings in Christianity in their places of worship, and because places of worship can have more than 6, for instance, that would increase the numbers there. But because namings don't happen in places of worship, and there are no similar provisions once the provisions for major life events were withdrawn last September, they've been more restricted since then. So it's just been an ongoing series of headaches.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that an existing injustice has been kind of highlighted and exacerbated, really, by coronavirus. Thanks for that, Richy. Bishop John, I do have a question for you, and this is peculiarly Scottish, I'm afraid. So between late December and March, unlike the rest of the UK, places of worship continued to be closed. Do you know why that may have been the case? And I suppose no one knows, you can't really read minds, but it's kind of, was that seen to be an injustice or unfair treatment when you look south of the border?
I think my impression, certainly north of the border and by extension south of the border, that the governments were acting in good faith. There was some outlying views saying that the there was elements in the government using this as a means of undermining religion and faith. I didn't really feel that at all. I think the difference between Scotland and England was that initially there was this kind of view, cultural view, that everyone was applying science, as though science had a kind of a mathematical 1 + 1 = 2 certainty about it, and therefore that you'd expect the same science to apply in England as in Scotland, as in France, as in Italy, and wherever. I think as things began to emerge, it began to be clear that it wasn't just science, it was also policy that was making the decision. And I think policy, dare I say, was affected by the personality of the politicians and the makeup of countries. And so I think, I'm speculating here, maybe it's a little bit fanciful, but maybe there's more of a cautious national spirit in Scotland and less of a caution in England. And when you go over to the United States, it's the land of the free and the home of the brave. So we all apply science according to our national psyche. And I think the Scottish national psyche was always, it showed itself with the same science coming out of Sage. England had a different approach to the science as Scotland did, and ours was cautious in that. And I think worship got caught up in that. So it wasn't just faith and belief sectors that were pointing out the difference north and south of the border, but other sectors as well were making the same kind of comparisons and pointing out, well, if it is the same science, why is it different? And therefore, it was clear that it was the judgment and the policy on the science. But specifically, that's what led, as I'd mentioned before, to the private late 26 Protestant ministers and one Catholic priest taking out a judicial review to evaluate, had the Scottish government acted within the law. The European, they really had asked whether it was acting within Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights as to religious belief and practice. And Lord Braid in his judgment said, no, the government hadn't acted lawfully. that it had been hadn't acted proportionately, so that when you are limiting human rights such as faith and belief, which can be limited, so that the right to belief and faith cannot be limited, that's absolute. But the right to manifest faith and belief can be, for pretty restricted circumstances. In this circumstance for public health, governments can restrict those, but under really narrow criteria, because they're such fundamental rights. And Lord Breda said, well, the government had not acted proportionately, because there would have been other less restrictive means to have contained the pandemic without having acted in the way it had done. And those proportionate means were things like the government could have asked religious leaders to close their places of worship, or asked the leaders of belief communities to make the restrictions voluntarily, thus respecting their independence and autonomy, or at least having given them that option. And that would have respected the autonomy of faith and belief communities. Secondly, they could have brought in laws that didn't criminalise faith and belief. So effectively, churches, if they had opened up, would have been criminalised for doing so. Well, there might have been better means of doing that. He said they didn't take into account the practical consideration, almost as if saying no one had walked through the government had walked through a place of worship to look at what kind of mitigation and infection control procedures were in place. Had they done so, they might have realised that churches were not above an acceptable level of risk. Mm. And finally, referring to worship as a non-essential social gathering, again, it lacked the kind of literacy of what religion is, and in doing so, those kinds of things, it hadn't acted proportionately.
It's very interesting, because I obviously meet, thank you for that, with members of lots of different faith communities as part of my job. And oftentimes when they're talking to my students, they will describe their practice. They'll say, I don't belong to a religion. My religion is a way of life rather than that. And I think that's perhaps the level of lack of literacy, if you like, that some people struggle with. But you raise a very interesting point that the former Prime Minister Theresa May made when some of these restrictions were placed. And I wonder what all of your thoughts are about this, leaving the pandemic behind as much as we can and moving forwards. She said, my concern is that the government today, making it illegal to conduct an act of public worship for the best of intentions, sets a precedent that could be misused for a government of the future for the worst of intentions. So I think in this situation, we might see, okay, COVID is an extreme situation and public health is at risk. And so maybe you might want to consider that, but she's saying something similar, I think, to you, Bishop John. So has it set a precedent, really, I suppose, in terms of freedom of religion and belief, that freedom can be suspended? And is that, and what's the problem with that, I guess? I don't know if any of you want to address that. Jagtar, it looks like you're about to speak. Yeah.
Yes. I think the former Prime Minister makes a valid point. If it's been done once, what would stop it happening again? So I think there is a responsibility on all of us as those believers of faith or even non-faith to ensure that if there was a similar scenario again, that we do act in a loud and united voice. Just going back to Bishop Keenan's point in Scotland, in England, places of worship were open from December to March, and there was individual faiths in England that were saying or applied for a judicial review prior to that, and to ensure places of worship remained open. And to be honest, from my experience, places of worship behaved very, very responsibly to ensure that the congregations and those attending the places of worship did so. The management committees or the management of the gurdwaras, to ensure that the congregation was safe, and that everything within the place of worship was COVID compliant, and I, very few cases, if any, came from those types of gatherings. There were probably more gatherings in supermarkets and other places in outdoor venues than there were in places of worship. So I think, all faiths, including the Sikh faith, acted very responsibly once we all understood how serious the pandemic was and how serious the loss of life was because of the pandemic. And I think going forward, definitely, I think we all need to be very mindful of government making these types of intrusions in our lives, whichever colour or politics of that government is, because there has been a precedent that's been set.
Thank you, Jagtar. Richy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the guarantor that we have to something like this not happening again, except in similar circumstances, is human rights, the Human Rights Act, the European Convention on Human Rights, and more generally, judicial review, the means by which human rights can be guaranteed. And I think that's why it's really important that as religion or belief communities, as well as speaking out for freedom of religion or belief, we also speak out on the need to defend human rights and judicial review more generally. So at the moment, the UK government is doing a review of both, or two separate reviews, one of each, I should say. And many groups are very concerned about that. We've been very active on defending judicial review and human rights. We've assembled a coalition that's now got over 200 organisations in it that simply said that there should be no rollbacks to human rights and judicial review. We also organised a letter from different religion or belief groups with Amnesty International on this matter, that was signed by people like the Bishop of Manchester and Rene Kassan and Lord Singh and the Jewish Council for Racial Equality and the Reform and Liberal Jews, making that call. And I think it's really important that everybody watching this recognises the need to stand up for human rights and judicial review in the round, so that that future scenario that Theresa May envisages could never come to pass.
I think that's really important, because sometimes we are seen as disparate lone voices in groups of religion and belief, but actually if it's a unified voice that is saying, I use the phrase, singing from the same hymn sheet, then essentially people will be able to do that. Bishop John, just kind of looking forwards, it's almost kind of what lessons have been learned about government and faith belief relations, and kind of what would you hope to see moving forward in terms of continued avenues of dialogue and considerations? You kind of mentioned a little bit before about a group of bishops, but I just wondered what your thoughts were on it and what we can learn from this process.
One of the kind of maxims, I suppose, of this pandemic is that there are things that we've learned that we don't want to unlearn. There are mechanisms that we have established that we don't want to disestablish. Others we certainly do. For instance, I think I would like to see a concerted effort by government, once the pandemic passes, to pass back power to the people, and to insist on that. I think people have almost got used to a sort of comfort blanket that someone will tell me how to run my life. There's a kind of attraction in that, but it's not really human. Governments aren't there, and they don't want to be there to tell us how to run our lives. So I would like to see our First Minister, our Prime Minister, I'm sure they'll be happy to do this, but at a certain point standing up and saying, don't ask me, decide yourself. It's like, we're just here to make sure that R doesn't go above a certain level. When it's way down, it's your choice, not ours. And to give people back the responsibility for their autonomy, because autonomy is first of all it's equally a responsibility as a right. But practically speaking, James, one of the things that has been established, a number of things in Scotland, we now do have weekly meetings. One is a Christian forum with the lead civil servant, and then another, a wider interfaith leaders forum, and those are weekly. And I think there's now an aspiration that rather than having been pro tem, will be more permanent, maybe more part of the culture, because it is all about mutual literacy. I mean, I'm sure, just like we complain that as faith and belief communities, the government perhaps lacks literacy of our position. Maybe we lack a certain literacy about their position and the parameters in terms of which they act. But I think ongoing, it's a culture of dialogue, cooperation, and engagement. I think a number of the results that government achieved, it could have achieved with us rather than without us. I think in faith and belief communities, we were as aware that there was a pandemic on as the government. We were as aware of the common good and the need for public health as they were, and there was an opportunity for the government to work and cooperate with religious leaders and say, you need to take this seriously as well. You need to ask the really difficult questions about how to balance belief with its due limits in terms of a pandemic. I think maybe ongoing, if we establish those fora and they keep and they allow us, and not just channels of communication, but genuine dialogue where we begin to understand each other's perspective, point of view, and world, and then begin to understand where are those lines of independence from each other and where are the channels of cooperation.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Jagtar, just kind of building on that, because obviously as a faith community, you've expressed kind of that your view was listened to and kind of accommodations were made. What about the engagement of faith communities with wider society in the role? Because obviously, as I look around and I see newspaper headlines of Sikhs who have provided langar and other things with different groups, how can we move forward, I guess, with greater involvement of faith and belief communities and their involvement with wider society, rather than just kind of huddling together?
Yes, I think all faith communities, played their part during the pandemic. The Sikh community, from its one of our pillars, is to help, to serve, to share, and langar is a leveler where it doesn't matter when you come into the Sikh place of worship, anybody can sit together and be served langar. And so that langar, which wasn't served within the gurdwaras, then left the gurdwaras and was served to those on the front line, to the key workers, to those that needed hot food. And you probably saw many examples all over the country, whether it was in Scotland or England, where places of worship opened their doors not for worshippers to come inside, but the langar that's cooked and made inside to leave the doors of the gurdwara to be served to those in need. And I think that was very powerful, and one of our pillars that showcased the good work and the belief of the Sikh faith. I think just going back to Bishop Keenan's point, I do agree the government has sort of spent a lot of time and a lot of effort, and we're sort of made to believe that it is only data that matters when it comes to the pandemic. And so science has sort of led the whole of the decision making during the pandemic. I think going forward, science will obviously play its important part, but I think belief and those of belief should play a more of a pivotal role when it comes to when it comes to looking at the data and some of the key decision making. So we were sort of involved further down the chain, where places of worship would need to open, but there were other times where I think faith could have played and would have played an important role much higher up the decision making. And I think that's what we need to, as faith communities, push for. And I think the review that's taking place by government at the moment, and how government engages with faith and faith communities, that we do contribute in that and make our voices very clear that actually faith matters to many, many people, many millions of people within the United Kingdom. And for faith to be taken seriously, it must be at the heart of decision making when it comes to the government making decisions, not just now during the pandemic, but all sorts of decisions that are made, whether to do with the environment, whether to do with education, whether to do with social care. There's an input that faith can make, and which is sometimes overlooked by decision makers. And when they're just focusing on data or on evidence, the faith has served us very well for hundreds and thousands of years and should continue to do so, and shouldn't be marginalized when it comes to decision making.
And that kind of brings us full circle to the original point that Richy made, is that humanists were involved in some areas, but in a big area they were excluded and their voices couldn't be heard. So it's interesting. And you mentioned the review that's taking place, and that slightly worries me in the sense that it closed in December, and here we are 7-8 months later, and there's no report, there's nothing. Now I know there is a pandemic going on, but there is a faith advisor who kind of could work with that. Now, we're nearly out of time, so just final thoughts, comments. If we go Richy, Bishop John, and then Jagtar, just any final thoughts you would like to share?
I think Bishop John's idea of having some kind of protocol developed during normal times that can then be called on an emergency is a good idea. I think making sure that people are consulted before decisions are made, however rushed things may be, is certainly worth attempting, even during a crisis. But more generally, for us, the really important thing is that things are constructed in an inclusive way, because it's far too often the case that the non-religious are left out, and just working out a structure that avoids that is something that can easily be done and prevent problems that may not be foreseeable from the start, but certainly in the case of this pandemic did subsequently arise. So that's I think the main point as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Richy. Bishop John, any thoughts?
And also from my point of view, to agree with something that Richy said, I mean, we are a government according to laws, and I think insofar as religion or belief are involved, and we don't want to be involved in any way except according to the law. That's really important. And the point that I would just echo that Richy was making is that the European Convention on Human Rights and the International Declaration on Human Rights are really thought long and hard from centuries of experience about the nature and identity and place of religion and belief in societies and its interrelation with the law. And there's a treasure of wisdom there, and those are the ultimate laws. And certainly in the UK, we have, through the Human Rights Act, we've enshrined the European Convention on Human Rights into our law, lock, stock and barrel. When the governments are not necessarily expert in the nuances and the depth of the law, our judges are, and that's why judicial review is so important. Judicial review is not citizens opposing the government. Judicial review should be seen in the context of citizens and government all wanting to act according to the law. And when this is in dispute, that the judicial review was as much a victory philosophically for the government as it was for those ministers and priests, because it helped us understand better how we're supposed to act according to law, which we all want to do, and particularly governments. So not just would I say that we don't want any limitations on judicial reviews, there are practical ones. We discovered in Scotland that the burden, financial burden and risk on private citizens in taking a judicial review makes it fearfully prohibitive. So obviously the governments don't want judicial reviews for anything and everything, but they have to be there as an instrument we all welcome. They have to be accessible to our citizens, and that means not just legally but practically accessible, and they have to be done in such a way that there's not an undue risk on citizens in simply trying to vindicate their rights.
Thank you so much for that. Jagtar, any final thoughts, comments?
completely echo both Bishop Keenan's and Richy Thompson's thoughts and their closing thoughts. I think for sort of South Asian minority communities living in the UK, this has been a bit of a sort of a wake-up call for us as well, in the sense that, you know, when government decides to restrict their belief, how they respond. And I think the judicial review was considered by Sikhs as well as you know, from Christian faiths as well. During the pandemic, when Sikhs felt that place of worship should be able to open, so that was an avenue that was looked down as well. So I agree that that should be protected and it shouldn't be any hindrance on that. But for myself, I think working together as faith communities, I know we try in our various networks, but we will still continue to need to work even harder and even further to ensure that what we faced in the last sort of year, 18 months, if it was ever to come back, that we do have a voice and a loud voice around the decision making. I think that's really important. And I think forums like this and the Freedom Declared Foundation, the work that you've done today and that you're going to do, will be really important in ensuring that, you know, that faith isn't sort of left to one side or seen as a, you know, something that an afterthought. That it is central stage when it comes to decision making.
That's fantastic, thank you. And it just put me in mind, I've been involved in lots of interfaith communities and some of them have been really good. Well, all of them have been really good, but some of them have just been kind of talking shops. So it's very interesting to get to know each other and get to know what we each believe, but there needs to be some kind of action based on each of those things. So it's nice to have had this conversation and it's been really wonderful, but it's kind of then thinking, well, what can I do next to put these things into action? And involvement, it sounds like the involvement that the three of you have had has been amazing, and kind of looking at your viewpoints has really helped me. So thank you all three of you for your comments and your contributions today. I'll close with that thank you, but also just a reminder that we do have another webinar coming up in which we'll discuss Article 18 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and how that has been affected by the UK response. So I think that will again touch on the judicial reviews and everything else that we need to do. So thank you all of you for your time today, and I'll say goodbye.